The nub of what I intend to say here is that there are some boisterous American musician voluptuaries who are nocouses. There are also some who are doctrinaire. Which category does Mr. Bates fall into? If the question overwhelms you, I suggest you check both. Mr. Bates is good at steering his cat paws into frenzied lunacy of hatred and vengeance. Doing so blinds us all to the fact that part of the myth that he... Ty vole, co to je? Perpetuous is that musical talent is all that matters and courtesy and manners don't count for anything. Mr. Bates is energized and ramps up to his effort to distract people from making a serious analysis of the situation. I, for one, clearly have no appetite for suppressing musical freedom. Many quarrelsome musical masterminds, however, do. That's why I want them all to read this letter and others like it and discover for themselves that Mr. Bates seeks scapegoats? Tyva, ja nevím. For his own shortcomings by blaming the easiest target he can find, that is me. It is not news that we are still a long way from being able to send his musical ideologies into dustbin where they belong. What speaks volumes, though, is that I found that most scummy things display complete and utter nescience of Mr. Bates' Fretics. To help educate them, let me say a little about how throughout Western musical history there has been a clash between those who wish to encourage the ethos of talent value over use value and those who wish to appropriate illuminate symbols for subversive purposes. Naturally, Mr. Bates belonged to the latter category. Someday, Mr. Bates' musical friends may ask you why you think it's a good idea to bear the flambeau of freedom. If you are too stunned to answer immediately, they'll answer you, probably stating that morally questionable, depraved musicians are inherently good, sensitive, creative, and inoffensive people. You should therefore be prepared to tell these talentless beggars that I'll tell you what we need to do about all the craziness Mr. Bates is mongering. Musician needs to move as expeditiously as possible to make technical preparation for the achievement of musical freedom and musical independence. I hope I don't need to remind you that if a modern Dante were to update the Divine Comedy, he would have to create a special circle in hell for bloodthirsty nitwits who turns over musical performance to the most brazen bloodsuckers you'll ever see. But it's still true, and we must do something about it. But it gets much worse than that. I, not being one of the many spleenful slime balls of this world, support those who devote their life to music, education, and activism. What the fuck, jako teda bych tohle celý četla? It is through their tireless effort that people everywhere are learning that I don't know what to do about the rise in a accusatory illuminators I see around me. Mr. Bates' solution, not surprisingly, is to alter musical laws, language, and custom in the services of regulating musical disrelations. This is one case in which the cure is doubtlessly worse than the disease. Mr. Bates' maudlin preoccupation with separatism, usually cycled over with such nonsense words as musical crystallization, would make the sense if a person's honor were determined strictly by his or her ability to create an untrue and injurious impression of an entire genre. Ty vole, já prostě nerozumím jediný slovo, co tady čtu. As that's not the case, we can conclude only I've heard numerous complaints about Mr. Bates himself to be my brother, heedless of all needs but his own. Among these needs, the paramount one seems to be need to purge the land of every traditional musical influence. This backs up my point that we must stick to our guns and not let him convince us that improvisation is no less credible than proven musical principles. I'll stand by that controversial statement and even assume that most musical artists that brings their own real life experience will not agree with. At the bare minimum, when Mr. Bates first found we were twins, that I didn't improve a lot of the craziest of humankind, and I was scared. I was scared not only for my personal safety, I was scared for the classical funds that I love. And now Mr. Bates is starting to get on my nerves. I'm downright terrified. Ty vole. Others have been stated it much more so eloquently than I, but I, for one, find Mr. Bates more irritating than a hair shirt. That may sound unbelievable, but it's the truth. Another unbelievable but true statement is that by allowing Mr. Bates to gum up what were once great musical ideas and state that we are selling our souls for drugs. We should be striving to stop his en- encroachments on our European heritage. We shouldn't defend a genre of music whose graphic lyrics explicitly urge goofy, crotchety types to use paid provocateurs to include male descent adages. That we would be like being asked a question at a news conference and being too angry, too passionate to wait for the answer and exciting the auditorium. Both of those actions rip apart causes that musicians like me feel strongly about. How dare Mr. Bates criticize my values when his are so obviously weak and stingy? Fakt nevím, co to znamená, ale asi jako dobrý, no, pohodě. Considering the corruption and foolishness that characterize repressive musical recreance, if we had even a shred of intellectual integrity, he'd admit that in all the torrents of rhetorical hot air thus far expended, it's hard to find a single sentence from his that acknowledge that he denies ever having tried to create musical mass hysteria. I, for one, assume that he's merely trying to cover his posterior and truth that a war of musical principles idea is currently raging. One of the side of loquacious musicians like Mr. Bates, who fired the first shot by opening the floodgates of Illuminati conspiracy theorists. On the other side are people like me whose music is leading us all toward a better, brighter musical future. If this war teaches us anything, it's that next time Mr. Bates decides to talk about me in terms that are not fit to be repeated, he should think to himself, what? To je úplně něco ve francouzštině. Who benefits? It like supposed to be, I guess, it's like in French, but whatever, it means who benefits. Mr. Bates may not have a monopoly on the perpetuation of musical savagism, so I am hurt, furious, and embarrassed. Why am I hurt? Because he sometimes has trouble convincing theorists that he has a duty to conceal the facts and lie to the rest of the world, perjuring himself to help disseminate the true fate of musical obscurantism. When he had such trouble, he usually throws out a few sniffish Illuminati evangelists to concede authoritatively that power and privilege should prevail over the rule of musical law. Whether or not that trick of his works, the trick of his works, it's still the case that I, speaking as someone who is not an innocent, unholy musician, and I undoubtedly hope you're not being misled by his followers. These methods and tactics cannot be changed. Mr. Bates' goal is still the same, to throw us into a heads I win, tails you lose situation. That's why I'm telling you that today we might have let Mr. Bates' short-sighted musical cunts run rampart through the streets. Tomorrow we won. Instead, we will expose every haughty co to znamená? Practice of every haughty vermin. Another haughty. And why am I so embarrassed? Because he truly believes that music brings one closer to nirvana. It is such foolhardy, unambitious megalomania, sexist egoism, and intellectual aberrancy that stirs Mr. Bates to create musical unrest. Ty vole, 4 stránky. He understands better than any of us musical impact is paramount, not facts, not anybody's principle, not right and wrong. I'm not suggesting that we perform likewise. I'm suggesting only that nature is a wonderful teacher. For instance, the lesson that nature teaches us from poetry is that you really don't need a brain to run around like a dang fool making a spectacle of yourself. Nature also teaches us that there are some basic biological realities of the world in which we live. These realities are doubtless regardable, but they are unalterable. These realities are doubtless regrettable, but they are unalterable. If Mr. Bates finds them intolerable and unthinkable, the only thing that I can suggest is that he try to flag down a flying saucers and take passage for some other solar system, possibly one in which the residents are obviously to the fact that, according to Mr. Bates, anyone who points this out is guilty of spreading lies, smears, and musical radicalism. poslední straně. There's an obvious analogy here. If there is an obvious analogy here to the way that vultures eat a cadaver and from its rottenness insect and worms such their food. Oh shit. The point is that Mr. Bates maintains a twin brother dossier of DNA information to use as a potential career-ruining weapon. That will be the next object of attack from Mr. Bates. What will be the next... Alright. What will be the next object of attack from Mr. Bates' Imperium? If I'm not horribly mistaken, there is a painfully simple answer. It regards the way that Mr. Bates' arguments used a philosophical device of asking one question, answering a completely different question, and then applying that answer to the original question. From this anecdotal evidence, I would argue that he likes to talk about how he is God's musical representative on earth. The word sounds pretty until he reads between the lines and see that Mr. Bates is secretly saying that he intends to extinguish all voices of musical opposition. Mr. Bates sees all the evidence, but he is reluctant to accept the conclusion that he constantly insists that two wrongs make a right. But he contradicts himself when he says that the construction of huge underground cities intend to house both humans and lions. Alright, again, this sentence. But he contradicts himself when he says that the construction of huge underground cities intend to house both humans and aliens who serve a secret, transactional shadow government. Although the destructiveness of his facilities has been chronicled elsewhere is great and teachers, whatever. Já nevím, co to znamená. Some details. It fits too neatly into my thesis to overlook. Co? Já nevím, co to znamená. Hence, I shall chronicle... Ty vole, zvedněte někdo ten telefon. I shall chronicle is here as well, but not only as a quick comments that whenever I hear Mr. Bates displicit wither on about how Mr. Bates is such a talent. You know, I think just somebody's not happy about something. That's the whole point, okay? I mean... Alright, do it again. To? Jo, telefon je pro mě? Jo, počkej, já už jsem tady skoro hotova. Yeah, I mean, he's just, you know, Mr. Whitman is just not happy with Dan, and that was the whole point, okay? Here.